Welcome back to the domain of Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we resume our exploration of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Let's delve deeper into these thought-provoking teachings together. Crafted meticulously by our team at Buddhist Audio Bookshelf, this audiobook shares the wisdom of Buddha. Your support in spreading these teachings is invaluable. Subscribe, like, and share to extend the reach of these transformative insights. Let's nurture a world enriched by the profound guidance of Buddha. Relax and absorb these teachings' essence as we journey on this enlightening path. Let's get started with Close to What You Know. October 16, 2006. Our minds are filled with all kinds of knowledge, but exactly how certain is that knowledge and how useful is it? Right now, as you're meditating, there's not much you need to know. You're sitting here focusing on your breath. So notice how the breath feels. If it doesn't feel comfortable, see what you can to do to make it more comfortable. In other words, notice what you're doing and notice the results. That's a very direct kind of knowledge. The sensation of ease or stress or whatever you're feeling with the breath. That's something you experience directly. That's the sort of thing you experienced back when you were a child before you knew language at all. It's a very direct kind of knowledge. As you move away from this level of experience, things get less and less certain. To function in many areas of life, we have to deal with uncertainties. But for the time being, let's stick with what's really certain. Just what you're doing with the breath and the results you're getting. Notice when you're putting too much pressure on the breath, or not enough pressure, not enough, meaning that the mind just starts floating away. As you do this, you're learning a very important principle. The principle of action. This, for the Buddha, is a basic truth: cause and effect, the actions you do and the results you get. When he described his awakening in its simplest terms, he put it as a principle of causality, which applied directly to this issue. What are you doing and what results are you getting? In particular, what are you doing that's causing suffering? What can you do to put an end to suffering? Those are his basic building blocks. As for other issues that come up in the practice, they should all be related back to those building blocks. Like the whole question of self. We're often told that the Buddha taught that there wasn't a self, but then immediately the question is, who's doing the actions? Who's receiving the results? What goes from one life to the next? But that's putting the cart before the horse, assuming that this teaching on not self, which is an interpretation, is the primary teaching. We forget that the primary teaching is the fact of action and result, skillful and unskillful. If you take that as your context, then the issue of self becomes a question of what kind of activity is self? And what are the results of selfing in different situations? When you look at your sense of self in that way, you begin to realize that it's something you do, something you put together given certain circumstances. You perceive a certain world out there, and again, that's an assumption based on some things you've done. Then you assume a self acting in that world. This selfing is not just metaphysical, it's often psychological. You sense certain motives that other people have, and you react to those assumptions. And what often happens is that you often suffer. If it's the 4-year-old you yourselfing, you suffer a lot. So you've got to remember that we need to be able to take those worlds apart, take that sense of self apart, see them both as actions. You create your sense of that particular world. You're reading the data, you're reading certain things into it, and you're coming out with suffering. So you need to learn how to read the data in a different way, a way that's not going to lead to suffering. This is one of the reasons why the breath is so useful, because you can step outside of a lot of your thought worlds by stepping into the world of the breath. You can always tap into the breath because it's always here as long as you're alive. And from this perspective you can look at action and its results in a very direct way, because your intentions are right here next to the breath. There's nothing in the body, nothing in the physical world, that's any closer to your mind than your breath. You keep looking away, out there, making assumptions about the world outside, and neglecting some very important data right here. You've probably heard those reports they've had of discovering planets around other stars beside the sun. Well, nobody so far has actually seen any of the planets. They have certain data that indicate regular fluctuations in the star's brightness that would suggest that there's a planet there. But what do they really know for sure in those experiments? Well, they know what they did to get the data they got, they know the raw data, and they know the assumptions and principles they used in interpreting the data. That's all they really know. But the conclusion that there's a planet depends on the assumptions, which may turn out right, may turn out wrong. But notice how they do that. The actual knowledge they're gained is the knowledge of how they ran the experiment and what kind of data they got, the raw data, the numbers that come out, and then what they did with those numbers. As for whether their conclusions are true, that's another matter. But what they know for sure is what they did and the raw data they obtained through their doing. As you meditate, you want to keep your focus that clear, that close. What are you doing with the breath? What are you doing with the mind? What assumptions are you using about the breath and the mind? And what results do you get? Sometimes you find yourself creating a sense of self around the breath. As you get more and more used to the breath energy in the body, you develop a set series of ways of identifying yourself as the breather, which will create certain patterns of tension in the body that are really, really tenacious. Some patterns of tension come and go with each breath. Others last a bit longer, but the ones associated with the breather, those tend to last. Which is why it's good to loosen up your conception of what it means to breathe, where the breath is coming in, what needs to be done for it to go out. You can think of the body as a large sponge, with the breath can come in from all directions. You don't have to pull it in through the nose. And breath energy is not something that you have to fight to pull in. It just comes in, goes out. It's all ready to come in if you just let it in. Think of it that way and you find yourself breathing in a different way. That shows you the power of your thought, the power of your assumptions, what they call attention, or manasikara, in the texts. So again, the knowledge here is knowledge of what you're doing and the results you get. That's the basic data, that's where your knowledge is clearest. When you move out away from that and make assumptions, you get more and more into the world of uncertainty. As I said earlier, you need some assumptions to function. Say you're dealing with a table. You learn that if you try to walk through the table, you can't. You bang your shins. So you learn to make some assumptions about the solidity of the table. But exactly how solid is that table? We think of solid mass as being that totally solid, totally filled, but it's not. You've probably read about all the atoms in the table, and how each atom contains a lot more space than hard matter. And even with the protons and electrons. Are they really hard? Are they just electromagnetic vibrations? Vibrations of what? Or are they just little distortions in space-time? You could keep on asking questions like this, but for the purpose of walking around the room, all you need to know is that if you try to walk through the space between the atoms, you can't do it. You keep bumping up against that sense of solidity. So which of these assumptions is true? They're all true. The question is which one is useful, and for what purpose? If you simply try to walk across the room and find a table in the way, remember the solidity of the table, so you don't bang your shins. If you want to develop psychic powers and walk through tables, that's another matter. But the important thing is that you realize all your knowledge of the world comes from your actions and the results you get from those actions. That's the basic data. And for the Buddha, that's the basic data too. It's just that he keeps reminding you. Keep looking back at your actions and don't get too sucked into your assumptions, into the worlds you create out of these things, or the different senses of self that you create around these things. Learn to look for the ones that are useful, the assumptions that are useful, for any given purpose. But also learn how to take them apart to remind yourself they are just that, assumptions, so that when they start causing harm or suffering, you can drop them. Realize that. That's not the right time. That's not the right place for those assumptions. The Buddha's assumptions about what's useful to know, what's not useful to know, parallel very closely his ideas about what's useful to speak about, or what's right to speak about. He says you speak about things that are true. But just because they're true doesn't mean you have to speak about them. You also have to look for whether they're useful. And even that's not enough. You have to look at what's the right time and the right place to speak about these things. Well, the same thing applies to truths. There are lots of truths about the world out there, just as there are lots of radio waves going through the air right now. Which truths are useful to tune into right now, given your sense of time and place? This is why the Buddha avoided questions about whether there is or isn't whether the world is eternal or not, because he realized that these questions are constructions. There are times when a sense of self is useful. When you want to be responsible, when you want to learn how to delay your desire for immediate gratification for the sake of long-term gratification. Those are times when you need a clear sense of self. But there are other times when a sense of self actually gets in the way of a deeper happiness. So you look at yourself as an activity, something you do, and then you can stop doing it when it's not useful. It's like having different perceptions of the world, the physical world, the psychological world, whatever worlds you are involved with. Tune into the frequency that's helpful right now, and let the other ones go. This is why we focus on the breath, because the breath is an area where you can establish an awareness that can begin to see these activities. How does the mind create a sense of self? How does it create a sense of world? What are the actual data that it's got right here? What are the assumptions that it builds things out of? When you're with the breath, you can see these things a lot more easily, because the breath is one of the building blocks from which these things are created. The way you manipulate the energy in your body is going to determine how you identify yourself, along with sense of the world you inhabit. If the energy in your body's really uncomfortable, whatever world you've got out there is going to feel confining. But if you can breathe through it, you can learn to walk through those uncomfortable worlds, dissolve them away. This doesn't mean that you can create anything you like out of anything at all. The results of your past actions place some limits on the realities you can create in the present. But when you stick with this level of just what are you doing and what are the results, that's when you stay closest to the truth. That's when you see most clearly what the possibilities are. What, at the present moment, is the most skillful way to interpret your experience of reality? What can you shape? What can you not shape? When you keep things on this level, you find you can deal with reality, shape your reality, in a much more skillful and beneficial way. Practicing your scales. October 19, 2006. Developing skill as a meditator is very similar to developing skill as a musician. You start out with the scales, say you're learning the piano and you want to play beautiful music, but they have you playing these dumb scales, and it can be pretty boring. But if you don't stick with the scales, you can't play the music. Over time, as you develop your ear, you begin to realize that there really is a skill to running your fingers up those notes. One of the signs of a really good pianist is his ability to make his run sound like water, totally effortless, and yet a lot of effort goes into getting there. It's the same with the meditation. Meditation is work, and there's a lot of grunt work in just getting the mind to settle down and stay still. It's important that you not get bored by it. You sit here with the breath and sometimes it seems like it's the hardest place to stay. The mind is off someplace else, and you've got to pull it back. It stays for a breath or two, and then it's off someplace else again. You've got to pull it back. It's the pulling back that's an important part of the meditation. That's mindfulness and alertness in action. That's directed thought and evaluation in action. Directed thought means just keeping your thoughts with the breath. In the process of strengthening those qualities in the mind, that's when you develop the foundation for good concentration practice. So there are two ways of meditating. One is just sitting here hoping that you'll hit the lottery, because there are times when things just come together on their own. But that can get frustrating, just wondering what tonight's meditation lottery is going to be like. Are you going to come in first? Are you going to come in last? There's no skill there at all. The other way of approaching it is to realize there's work to be done. It may not be fun, but keep reminding yourself that this is how good meditation is built. This is how you develop an understanding of the mind, by understanding that process of how the mind slips off. It's really amazing. The mind can create all kinds of thought worlds for itself. How does it do that? How does it conduct its discussion of where it's going to go, how it's going to get there? And then how does it cover all that up so you don't notice it? It all seems to happen just on its own, but if you can see into that, you learn an awful lot about the mind. You learn about ignorance, for one thing, which is the big cause of suffering. You learn about craving. What does the mind crave as it's creating these worlds? It's craving pleasure. It can be sensual pleasure. The idea of thoughts of beautiful things, thoughts of nice-sounding things, so on. Down the line. Or it's craving a sense of identity that comes in with this. When you're in the world, you're functioning in a world here fighting off annihilation. You fear that if there are no thoughts in the mind is just going to disappear, your awareness is going to disappear. As long as you're thinking and knowing the results of your thoughts, you know you exist. And there is the potential for happiness there. We learn at a very early age that by developing a sense of self, we can use it to provide for pleasure in one way or another. If we were deprived of that sense of self, and this is why so many of us resist the idea of letting go of that sense of self, we'd feel that we'd be deprived of our potential for pleasure, or of the sense of self that's experiencing the pleasure. The craving for this kind of identity is called craving for becoming. So just in this process of the mind creating thought worlds, you see a lot about ignorance and craving, and all the other factors of dependent co-arising. You watch them in action. It's all happening right here. But instead of having to memorize the lists of dependent co-arising, the best way to learn about these things is just to get your hands dirty, deal with the causal chains that go on in the mind, and learn how to cut them. You'll find that you cut them in different spots depending on how quickly you notice what's going on. This way you learn about the mind. You learn about the processes in the mind in the same way that you learn about eggs by cooking with them, or you learn about a piano by sitting down and playing it, seeing what you can get out of it, what kind of sounds, what kind of satisfaction. So it's important, as you sit down and meditate, that you realize you're not here just for stress relaxation, stress reduction, or for chilling out. There is work to be done. This is your concentration work, as Ajahn Lee called it. The directed thought and evaluation, keeping your mind with the breath and learning to watch it, to see which ways of breathing help keep you there with the breath, alert and mindful, which ways of breathing make you restless. You learn this through the evaluation, i.e., evaluating times when the mind gets restless and wanders off. Go back and say, okay, gotta try something else. You've got to be willing to learn, and it can be frustrating. Any learning experience involves some pain, some effort and frustration, and your ability to deal emotionally with the frustration is what's going to see you through. So learn how to give yourself pep talks. You have to keep yourself up for the practice. This is why there are times when it's useful to reflect on the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. What kind of person was the Buddha who found this path of practice? Everything indicates that he was an extremely truthful person, very realistic, always willing to learn. And he taught purely out of compassion. After his awakening, he didn't need anything from anybody. If there wasn't enough food to keep his body going, he would be perfectly happy to die, because he'd already found a deathless happiness. So the fact that he kept the body going, kept having to deal with people 45 years, was a total act of compassion. And the Dhamma he taught, as they say, was totally heartwood. In other words, there wasn't a lot of rhetoric, a lot of unnecessary teachings. He focused on the big issue in life. Why is there suffering? Why do people create suffering for themselves when they want happiness? What can they do to learn to put an end to that suffering? And he focused on that issue in a way that's still very relevant thousands of years later. As for the Sangha, he instituted an order where people live totally on gifts. The Buddha's teaching was a gift. The way the Sangha is arranged, monks live on gifts. They don't sell the teaching, they don't have to raise kids, meet mortgage payments, all the other things that would crimp their style of really being true to the Dharma. You look at the stories in the Therigatha and Therigatha, telling of the monks and the nuns struggling with their meditation, and some of them were in a lot worse places than you are right now. And yet they were able to gain awakening. So that gives you encouragement that it can be done. Not just amazing people like the Buddha who can do it, all kinds of people can do it. When you reflect on these things, it gives you encouragement for the practice. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha also prefaced meditation practice with practicing generosity and observing the precepts. As you follow the Buddha's teachings in ways that are simpler and easier to follow and see the results that come, it gives you confidence in the teaching. That even though some of the instructions may seem counterintuitive, they work. When you come to the practice fortified by these practices and fortified by your understanding of where this teaching came from, that can help get you over the dry periods when all you seem to be doing is dragging your mind back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, up and down the notes of the piano. But that sense of confidence has to be augmented also by your willingness to be observant. There's a book in our library on learning how to swim. It's there not because the monks are planning to swim, but because it describes the learning process so well. It talks about how to practice swimming, and the principles apply to any kind of skill that when you're practicing, you don't just go through the motions or put in the time. You have to observe what's the most efficient way of getting through the water. How do you hold your head? How do you watch your stroke to see how you can make your stroke more efficient, so you can use less energy and at the same time go faster, go longer? It's the same way with working on those scales. What's the most efficient way of holding your hands, your arms, your torso to get the best sounding notes out of the piano? This way, what in the beginning is a very effortful process really does become effortless as you streamline your understanding of what you are doing. It's the same with the meditation. You find that you have to learn how to streamline your understanding of what it means to keep the mind focused. You start out by basically doing too much. You tense up the body, you engage all kinds of other parts of the mind to try to keep the mind here, and yet you can't maintain that amount of tension. The mind is sure to slip off. Then you try to have no effort at all, and of course it's going to slip off again. What you've got to do is notice which part of the effort is necessary, which part is not. Where's the excess energy that's being expended on this that's making it more difficult than it has to be? What's the most efficient way of staying with the breath? What's the most efficient place to focus? The most efficient way of understanding the breath that helps you stay there, so that the amount of effort you put into each moment of meditation is totally possible, totally sustainable. That way you really do develop a sense of ease with being with the breath. So you've got to be observant. It's in this way that directed thought and evaluation eventually lead to a sense of ease, even a sense of rapture, and the mind can really settle down. Because it's not just a matter of forcing, but it's also a matter of understanding what you're doing and looking through that lens of where's the unnecessary stress, where's the unnecessary amount of effort that's being expended. When is the effort too much? When is too little? When is it just right? This is why only so much of the meditation can be taught in terms of word saying, do this, do that, the technique they tell you to do. A lot of it has to come from your own input, your own willingness to observe, to learn from your mistakes. The process is not necessarily pleasant, but it's the only way to learn. And it has the advantage that it develops your powers of perception, your powers of discernment while you do it. So just as when you learn how to play the scales well, you're learning a lot of the other skills you are going to need to play music well, in the same way when you learn how to keep the mind with one object, in spite of all those other temptations to create worlds that you want to inhabit, you're learning the precise skills that are needed to get the mind to settle down. You're learning the skills that enable you to understand the workings of the mind. This is what's meant by that saying that the path and the goal are not different. In other words, in doing the path well, you find right there in the doing of the path that the goal starts to appear. So don't just put in the time, saying, I hope I win the lottery this time when the results will come on their own. You've got to watch, you've got to observe, you've got to be willing to learn. Even if it means going back and relearning the steps that you think that only beginners have to do, everybody has to learn these things many times over. And the more attention you pay to them, the more lessons you learn. Feeding frenzy. Dependent co-arising. October 23, 2006. The Pali word for the worlds we create in the mind is bhava, which literally means becoming. We keep creating these worlds. And if you look at dependent co-arising, you see that they're based on two things. The immediate prerequisite is clinging, upadana, and clinging in turn is based on craving, tanha. But both of those words have another meaning. The word for clinging can also mean feeding, taking sustenance, and the word for craving means thirst. The mind is thirsting for things, and so it latches on to the five aggregates and tries to feed off them. Form, feeling, perception, thought constructs, and sensory consciousness. These are the things we feed on. When we're meditating, we're trying to create a good bhava, a good place for the mind to stay in the present moment. If you create a world for yourself that maintains its reference to the present, then it's a lot easier to see what that world depends on in the present as well. In other words, you can see the process of thirsting and feeding as it's happening. That enables you to see through the process, so that you don't get misled by the worlds you create. When you create worlds of the past and future, though, you have to block out large parts of your present awareness in order to stay focused on those little worlds. That's why they're not helpful in the meditation. They're helpful only to the extent of enabling you to remember things you did in the past or anticipate in the future that help focus you back on the present. In other words, you can remember the times when you were mindless, not very alert, and you can reflect on the damage it caused. Or you can reflect on the dangers that await you in the future if you're not mindful and alert. This kind of thinking is helpful because it motivates you to get back to the present moment to develop your powers of mindfulness and alertness right now. But if you want to see these processes in action, you've got to watch in the present moment. So you create the world out of the breath, your inner sense of the body. Take the sensations you feel in the legs and the arms, etc., and try to fashion them into a basis for concentration, a place where the mind can stay, that you can take as your dwelling. The sense of ease and fullness you can develop through the breath can help to alleviate your thirst. It gives you something good and nourishing to feed on. The texts actually talk about feeding on rapture. In the midst of a world of hungry people, the Buddha said, we feed on rapture like the radiant gods. And he's not just talking about hungry in the sense of hungry for physical food. If you look at what's going on in the world, if you read the newspapers and news magazines, you see what people are doing from their sense of psychological hunger, and it's not a pretty sight. So when we say that in the midst of hungry people, we're feeding on rapture like the radiant gods, it's not a selfish or narrow pleasure. We're trying to get ourselves out of that feeding frenzy. This process of psychological feeding is a process we have to understand in the mind. How does this happen? The Buddha says that there are 4 ways of clinging or feeding inside. One is simply feeding on sensual desire. You can think about situations you'd like to have in your life that would make you feel pleasant, that you would derive some pleasure from. You can think about times in the past when you had pleasures, or about pleasures you anticipate in the future. And the mind feeds off of that. There's also feeding on views, clinging to views. Then, as you've probably noticed, there's a strong sense of me or mine around the clinging, feeding on the identity you build around your views. I'm the person who has the right views, I'm the person who understands things better than other people, my take on things is right. And there's feeding on certain ways of doing things, your habits and practices, your particular way of doing things that you feel is the right way of doing things, in and of itself. Now, some of these forms of food are actually part of the path. You need to have views for the path, you need to develop certain habits and follow certain practices as part of the path. And you need to develop a certain sense of yourself as capable of following the path. The Buddha doesn't criticize these things at their proper time and place. What he does criticize is feeding on these things as ends in and of themselves. And why does the mind feed on these things? Because it feels empty without them. Sometimes it feels lost without them, deprived of its bearings. We create our bearings for ourselves through our views, through our ways of doing things. What it comes down to is that we think we need these things for our happiness. Without them, we feel lost. These are our means we think for attaining pleasure. These attitudes are based on thirst. The thirst for sensuality, the thirst for becoming, or the thirst to destroy what we've got. But all these things are motivated by a desire for happiness, by a desire for well-being. The thirst in turn is conditioned by feelings of pleasure or pain, or neither pleasure nor pain, a neutral feeling. And these come from sensory contact. So one way of understanding the processes in the mind is try to trace them back. Exactly what contact triggered them? Was there a thought? Was there a sound? Was there an idea that suddenly triggered you into creating these worlds? That's one thing you've got to look for. What are the triggers? Sometimes, you find, the triggers can be very small. But dependent co-arising digs deeper than that. It says that the issue is not just the contact. We come to sensory contact with a lot of preconceived notions, a lot of attitudes ready to pounce on things. This is why contact is not the beginning of dependent co-arising. Prior to contact you've got the senses, and prior to the senses you've got name and form. Name and form are crucial here, particularly name, for it includes feelings, perceptions, intentions, attention, and the contact among these things in the mind. This is why the Buddha focuses the practice of the path right here, at the processes of name. You've got to change your intention. You've got to change the way you understand things, which things you pay attention to, which things you ignore. Our usual approach for happiness is that you identify with certain things. Your sense of who you are, who's going to benefit from these efforts you're making to create happiness, and exactly what things you have under your power, under your control, that can be used to create that happiness. That's all an issue of attention. How you attend to things, how you look at them, what your perspective is, what questions you ask. And that big question, the question of I, who am I? Do I exist? Do I not exist? That's a constant question, and we're always coming up with different answers. And because that question eats at us, we try to create an identity to stuff into its mouth. But you can learn to stop feeding on it if you can keep reminding yourself that that's not the issue. The issue is simply what can be done to lead to happiness, which sometimes requires a sense of self, but sometimes doesn't. This is why right view is the beginning of the path, because it focuses particularly on the most skillful way of attending to things. Once you've got a skillful way of attending to things, that changes your intentions. So the focus of your attention should be to understand: what is the cause of suffering? What are the causes for the end of suffering? If I see myself doing something that leads to suffering, how can I stop? If I see that there are states of mind that lead to an end to suffering, how can I encourage them? How can I develop them? Those are intentions that you've got to nourish. Otherwise, when the usual triggers for craving and clinging or thirst and feeding come along, you go right back to your old feeding patterns. So to help strengthen the new way of giving attention, or the new way of developing intentions, the Buddha has you develop certain perceptions. You've probably heard of the 3 characteristics, but it's interesting to note that the term 3 characteristics doesn't appear in the Pali Canon. The Buddha talks about anicca, dukkha, and anatta, but he doesn't use the word for characteristic, lakkhana, to go along with them. He uses the word perception or mental label. Anicca sana, dukkha sana, anatta sana. You learn to label things as inconstant, stressful, not self. The other word he connects with them is anupassana, or contemplation. Aniccanupassana. To contemplate is to look for these qualities in your experiences. In particular, you look at the raw materials that you ordinarily use to build your sense of yourself, to build your sense of the world, to see how they're inconstant. When the raw materials are inconstant, how are you going to build anything solid out of them? It's like building a house out of frozen meat. The meat seems solid, you can stack it like bricks, but it's going to melt. Who would want to live in a house like that? It's stressful. It's asking for disaster. So you look for the stress inherent in trying to find happiness in things that are inconstant. When you see the raw materials as stressful, ask yourself, what can I build out of stressful things that would really provide true security? And when you see that they're not totally under your control, when they're anatta, What sense of reliable self could you build out of these things? You can build a temporary sense of self, and there are times when you need that, but ultimately it doesn't give the satisfaction you want. That's because these thought worlds, once you set them going, start doing things on their own. They have a logic of their own, which you can't always anticipate. So how can you trust them? These are the factors the Buddha has you focus on: attention, intention, and perception, so that when you catch the mind jumping at the opportunity to build a thought world, you can ask yourself, why am I doing this? What am I going to get out of it? You look at the raw materials and you see that they're not the sort of things you could build anything reliable out of. Then you look at your motivation. Why are you doing this? What do you want out of this? You start asking the Buddha's questions. Does this activity lead to suffering, or does it lead away from suffering? These are the things you've got to keep in mind. One way of doing that is to develop a good solid foundation here in the present, so that it's easier to stay in the present. The longer the mind stays in the present, the easier it is to be mindful and alert. The more mindful and alert it is, the more clearly it can see these processes as they're happening. Dig down a few more steps into dependent co-arising, and you come to fabrication. Fabrication comes in three kinds: bodily, verbal, and mental. Bodily fabrication is the breath, verbal fabrication is directed thought and evaluation, and mental fabrication is feeling and perception. When you're focused on the breath, thinking about and evaluating the breath, you've got all these things right there. You've got the breath, you've got yourself thinking and evaluating the breath, and you've got the feelings of pleasure and pain that come from the breath, along with perceptions that keep you focused both on the breath and on the pleasures or the pains that come from the breath. When you learn to look at things in these terms and can maintain this world, you're in a much better position to watch the process of how the mind creates other worlds. When it forgets, when it tries to block out this world of the present, that's the ignorance that sets those other thought worlds into motion. So you've got to keep reminding yourself, stay here, stay here, stay here. Try to get as interested in the breath as you can. Try to understand. What is this bodily fabrication, this breath energy, anyhow? How does the in and out breath relate to the sense of energy in the different parts of the body? How can you create a sense of ease here that helps to satisfy you, that helps get rid of that hunger to go out and create other places, other worlds to go foraging in? The greater the sense of fullness you've got here, the fullness that comes from learning how to relate properly to the breath, the more you can cut through the hunger, the thirst, that would force you to create other worlds of being, other worlds of becoming. So when you look at dependent co-arising, it's not just an abstract exercise. It actually explains a lot of the reasons why the Buddha teaches meditation the way he does, why he tended to teach breath meditation more than any other kind of meditation, and why the path begins with right view. Right view helps redirect this causal process away from the ignorant clinging and thirst that ordinarily we feed on, or that we try to feed on, trying to find some satisfaction, and focuses it in a direction where it provides more satisfaction, a greater sense of fullness. Dependent co-arising, not just a map about abstractions, it's actually a map of your feeding frenzy. And even though the map has lots of factors that even the Buddha admitted are all entangled, it does make one clear and simple point. When contact hits, it's not just making a mark on a blank slate or a passive mirror. The mind is already primed to go looking for food even before contact happens. When we encounter contact, our main question is whether we can eat it. This is why we have to meditate. The causes for suffering are inside. And this is why the Buddha has us focus attention on our intentions, perceptions, and views, because as long as we're ignorant of these things, that ignorance keeps driving our feeding frenzy. Which is why dependent co-arising is also a guide to what you can do to help abort this process of constantly creating unsatisfactory feeding worlds in the mind, worlds that lead to suffering, worlds that lead to stress. It teaches us new feeding habits. When we learn how to feed on the breath, we don't have to create the different identities that need to go out and engage in a feeding frenzy on other people. And it's good not just for us, but also for everyone around us. So develop a taste for the breath. Learn how to be a connoisseur of your breathing. When you learn to feed here, you really develop the various strengths of the mind: conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment that can strengthen it to the point where ultimately it doesn't need to feed anymore. And that's a great gift right there, both to yourself and to everyone around you. 82. Goodwill all around. November 2nd, 2006. Every evening before the meditation, we chant the 4 Brahmaviharas. Actually, just chant the words that are meant to be conducive to these sublime attitudes. And they are meant to remind you that it's good to actually cultivate these attitudes as part of your practice. They are the context for what we're doing, thoughts of goodwill. If the Buddha's teachings weren't based on a motive for goodwill, he wouldn't have focused on the issue of suffering, the issue of stress. He wouldn't have focused on the question of how to put an end to suffering and stress as the primary point of the Dharma. So we have to assume that that was the underlying motive, both for his teaching and for the practice of his teachings. That's what we are doing right now. We are looking for an end of suffering, trying to find a true happiness. So cultivate that attitude. May I be happy. May I be truly happy, with the emphasis on the truly, because that places some demands. Ordinary happiness, the pleasures that come from eating and sleeping and having fun, aren't all that hard. There is no need to sit for a whole hour and put up with the pains and other difficulties in meditation if all you want is a quick fix, if a quick fix is good enough. But it's not, because a happiness that turns into something else doesn't turn into happiness. It turns into regret, remorse, actual pain. So we want a happiness that's true, a happiness that lasts. But think about it. You are not the only one who wants happiness. The people around you want happiness too. If your happiness were to depend on their misery, there's no way they would allow it to keep going. This is why oppressive people have to hire bodyguards, have to have special security forces to protect a very fragile oppressive happiness. And it can never last. So you want a happiness that doesn't take anything away from anyone else, doesn't cause anyone any suffering or harm. And that requires that you look inside. And to keep you looking inside, it's good to remind yourself that you do wish happiness for other beings, other people, because your happiness depends on, at the very least, you're not causing them any harm. And the world would be a much better place, a lot easier to find happiness, if everybody were looking for true happiness inside. And so the Buddha advocates spreading thoughts of goodwill in all directions. As they say in the text, first direction, in other words, the east, the second, third, fourth, south, west, north, above and below and all around. Let your thoughts of goodwill go out in all directions, radiating. The image they give in the texts is of a hornblower. You blow the conch horn. There was a conch shell that they used as a horn. And the sound goes in all directions. It doesn't choose just the east or just the west, goes everywhere. In other words, your thoughts of goodwill should extend not just to your tribe or to your group, but to everybody regardless. Not only human beings, all kinds of beings. Beings you know about, beings you don't know about. Try to make your wish for happiness all-inclusive. The Buddha recommends this as an attitude to develop as a context for the practice. Because one of the big problems we run across in our meditation is thoughts of greed, anger and delusion. And one way to overcome them, or at least to keep them in check, is to remind yourself you've already wished happiness to these other beings. So why do you want to be greedy for their things? Why do you want to get angry at them? Why do you wish them ill? How can you let yourself be deluded as to what's going to be skillful and what's not if you really want to be happy? In other words, you've got to take the issue of happiness seriously. Most people, you'd think they would take happiness seriously, it's something everybody wants. But if you look at the way people go about trying to find happiness, they don't really think about it. They don't reflect on where true happiness would lie, how it could be brought about. They just go for the quick fix. So thoughts of goodwill are meant to prevent you from going for that quick fix, remembering that your actions do have results, and you want to make sure those results are not harmful. If you run across anyone who you have trouble thinking thoughts of goodwill for, ask yourself why. How would you benefit from their misery? How would there be any benefit from their misery at all? Why are you stingy with your thoughts of goodwill? In other words, the development of goodwill is not meant to be non-reflective, spreading thoughts of cotton candy out in all directions to smother your true feelings about people. They are meant to bring up the issue, is there anybody out there whom you don't feel goodwill for? And if so, why? Then you have to think about it, you have to reflect on it until you realize there's no reason that you would benefit in any way from their suffering. So this provides the context. Then from goodwill there are the other three attitudes. Compassion, in other words, when you see someone suffering you wish them freedom from that suffering. When you see someone who is happy, you appreciate the fact that they are happy. You don't get resentful, you don't get jealous. Those are natural outgrowths of goodwill. And then there's equanimity. Because there are going to be cases where you wish for people's happiness, and they're not happy. You try to show compassion for them, and they can't gain freedom, they suffer. Other people who are happy, but then they use that happiness to abuse other people and there is nothing you can do about it. That's why you've got to develop equanimity. Without equanimity, goodwill can be a cause for suffering in and of itself. So that's when you have to reflect. All beings are the owners of their actions. Some people have karma that's going to force them to suffer for a while, or at least have bad circumstances. The issue of how they respond to those bad circumstances, that's something they can do something about, perhaps in that way you can help them. In other words, our experience is not totally shaped by past actions, it's also shaped by our present intentions. This applies to other people, applies to you too. There are going to be times when you are in difficult circumstances, and you've got to be careful about your intentions, how you respond to those difficulties. There are going to be times when you're in really good circumstances, and again you have to be careful. You can't let yourself be heedless. Other times people, when things are going well, they are wealthy and in a good mood, then they tend to get sloppy, complacent, and that's a cause for suffering right there. So equanimity is there to remind you, there is this principle of karma that places limitations on what you can do for other people, what you can do for yourself. The purpose of that reflection is to remind you to focus on the things where you can make a difference. Sometimes, given the situation, all you can do is just work on how you're reacting to bad circumstances. This is why we have to train the mind. This is how the Brahmaviharas lead us into the development of mindfulness and alertness. There is a passage where they talk about how the Brahmaviharas lead to awakening. It's the Brahmaviharas imbued with the 7 factors for awakening. And the first of those is mindfulness, the ability to keep something in mind. In this case, keeping your basic attitudes, your basic attitude of goodwill in mind. And your knowledge of the principle of action, principle of intention, that you've got to be careful about what you will, what you do, what you say, what you think, got to keep that fact in mind. And then train the mind so it's more and more careful all the time, more mindful all the time. This is why we use the breath or use the word buddho, or 32 parts of the body. Whatever object we find is easy to keep in mind as a way of getting the mind to settle down. Once the mind settles down, it can see things a lot more clearly. And that's how it can be more careful in what it chooses to do. This is how the 4 Brahmaviharas, or the 4 sublime attitudes, bring us right here. You've got work to do. You've got this mind that keeps churning out intentions, so we've got to be very careful about what those intentions are, which ones we choose to follow, which ones we choose to let go. We've got to keep that in mind. It requires mindfulness, requires alertness. We've got to work on these qualities, we've got to exercise them. This is why we are sitting here meditating. These are qualities that need strengthening, they need to be made more and more consistent, more lasting. So as you work with the breath, try to be as quick as possible in noticing when the mind slips off the breath. As soon as you sense that it's slipping, then bring it right back. This is the work of the meditation. This is how mindfulness and alertness are exercised, and with exercise they get stronger just like the body. If you exercise it the right way, If you feed it the right way, you can keep the body in relatively good shape so that it can do what you want it to do. Same with the mind. You feed the mind with these thoughts of goodwill, thoughts of the sublime attitudes, and you exercise its mindfulness and alertness. Try to develop its concentration in that way, to develop its discernment into what's going on in the mind. What you choose to do, what you choose not to do. And you gain insight also into this whole question of what does it mean to intend, what is an intention, what is this karma we are doing all the time. Once you see that clearly, then you are in a much better position to act on that basic motivation for goodwill. You can get the mind to do what you want it to do, and it's strong enough to do what you want it to do. You've got that desire for true happiness. For true happiness you need a well-trained mind, a mind that's not afraid to comprehend suffering, let go of its cause, develop the factors of the path, so it can realize the end of suffering. Otherwise, even though we all desire happiness, we just keep creating more and more suffering, which is the big irony of life. But it's possible to train the mind. So keep at it. Keep remembering your intention, try to maintain that intention and try to develop the skills that are needed to keep acting on that intention. So you can test whether the Buddha is right. There is an end to suffering, and it can be attained through human effort. Truths of the Will. November 5, 2006. Someone once said that there are basically two kinds of truths in the world. Truths of the observer, and truths of the will. Truths of the observer are things that are true regardless of what you do, that have nothing to do with your ideas about things, what you want, what you don't want. They're just the way of the world. This is what science is all about. And to learn these truths, you can't let your wants get in the way. This kind of truth also describes a lot of things you see day to day. As for truths of the will, those are things that exist only if you will them into being. They depend on your wants. You decide that this is something you want and you act on it. Say you want to be a concert pianist. That's going to become true only if you decide that this is something you really want, that it's worth working on, and you stick with that decision. When you look at the things that mean the most to us in life, most of them are truths of the will. If you just looked at the world from the point of view of an observer, everything would be pretty pointless. We get born, we grow up, we struggle to survive, and then we die. That's pretty much it. What's the point of all that? Many times you look back on your life and you think of all the things that you fought over, all the things that you worked hard to get, and even if you got them, they just slipped through your fingers. You wonder, what was that all about? Many people look back on their whole lives and that's all they see. What was that all about? Why all that suffering? So if you want to have a point to your life, you have to will it into being. Many of the Buddha's teachings explain why this is so. Your experience of the present moment comes from what? The results of past actions, your current intentions, and the results of your current intentions. That's an interaction between truths of the will and truths of the observer. I.e., you willed things in the past, and then that set into motion certain causal forces, some of which came out in ways you didn't intend. But that's simply because that's the way the world is. That's how causality works. You didn't work the process right. But now you've got your current intentions and they're having an effect right now, and they are going to have an effect on into the future, and they offer you the chance to get it right this time. So it's up to you to decide. Is there going to be a point to all this? Is there going to be a direction to all these different intentions? Or are you just going to muck around in your life, and at the end wonder what was that all about? Even the way we suffer comes under these two kinds of truths. There's the truth of the three characteristics, which is that anything willed is going to be inconstant, stressful, and not self. Anything that's subject to conditions is going to be stressful. But then there's also the suffering that comes from craving, especially unskillful craving. The first kind of suffering you can't do much about, but you can make a difference with that second kind. This is an area where your will has a lot to say, has a lot of impact if you focus it properly. Putting an end to suffering is a big job, but it is humanly possible. And because it is possible, it's really worthwhile to focus your energies in that direction. That really does give a worthwhile direction to your life. Some people decide they want to be a concert pianist, but then when they become a concert pianist, they find that it's not really as fulfilling as they thought it would be. Someone wants power, gains power, and then abuses it, misuses it, creating a lot of suffering, both for himself and for a lot of other people, which is going to have consequences for a long time down the line. So for your life to have a point, you have to have a goal, and you want to choose a wise goal. This is why the Buddha seems to be the wisest. A total end to suffering. That requires developing a lot of important qualities in the mind, things you have to will into being. You look at your life and it doesn't seem like there's much opportunity to put an end to suffering, but again you're looking at the things that an observer would look at. The end of suffering is a truth of the will, and if you focus your energies in that direction, it does become possible. You look at all the verses of the elder monks, elder nuns, and a lot of them started out in really miserable circumstances. If you just looked at the facts of their lives, you would have thought, no chance for this person, and yet somehow they pulled themselves together and decided that this is what they wanted out of life. After all, desire is a factor of the path. It's right there in right effort. You generate desire to develop skillful qualities, you generate the desire to abandon unskillful qualities. That kind of desire is good. You just need to learn how to focus it properly, to create the right conditions. I was reading a book a while back on analyzing people who had started out their adult lives in really bad shape psychologically, and yet they were able to pull themselves together. Tolstoy was an example. As a young person he looked pretty hopeless, and then he somehow pulled it all together and became a great novelist, an inspiration to a lot of peacemakers. In the book I was reading, it was basically psychotherapy applied to history or psychoanalysis applied to history, which often is a pretty sordid affair. Usually they want to ferret out who had strange sexual desires and who had strange psychological problems and just leave it at that. But in this case the analysis was meant to derive lessons on how is it that some people who start out in really bad shape manage to get it together. That psychoanalysis applied to history with a real point. The conclusions were not anything really surprising, but it's important to remember that some of the basic facts of life, the most important ones, are things we tend to overlook. The conclusions here pointed out basically two things. First, in each case the person found someone who really believed in him or her and encouraged him or her to develop skillful qualities. Second, that person had a belief system that emphasized that it really was important to make something of yourself, something of more than just ordinary value. This is what we have in the Dharma and the Sangha. For the Sangha, you've got people who believe in the worthwhile endeavor, the value of developing skillful qualities, and encouraging other people to develop skillful qualities. It creates the right social environment for learning how to mature. And then second, there's the system, the belief system or the values of the Dhamma that, if you develop skillful qualities in your mind, it really does make a difference not only for yourself, but for all the people around you. There is a value to learning how to will, or to intend things in a skillful way. It really does make a difference. Science can't teach you that. Science tells us that the sun is going to go nova someday, so all your efforts to do something with your life are going to get burned up anyhow. Scientists just are concerned with truths of the observer. We're dealing with truths of the will. What do you want to make with your life? It's possible to make all kinds of things given the raw materials you have. Often you may find that, given your past karma, current circumstances are not all that good. But remember several things. 1. Past karma is not totally determining what's going to happen in the future. You make decisions from moment to moment. 2. What you see right now is not the sum total or running balance of your karma account. Think of your past actions more like lots of accounts, or lots of seeds that can sprout and grow and blossom at different times. You may be going through a fallow period right now when not many good seeds are blossoming, and some bad seeds are blossoming instead, but that doesn't mean you don't have good seeds in your karma accounts. So what you want to do is to work right now on what the skillful decision is right now. As for what's going to come from your past karma, learn how to treat whatever it is with skill. Associate with people who will encourage you in that direction. Encourage within yourself the beliefs and understandings that give value to that way of approaching your life. Because one of the things about truths of the will is that often you see people for whom you think, there's no chance that this person is going to be a concert pianist, there's no chance that this person is going to make anything out of his or her life. That's what it looks like from the outside. But a lot of very unlikely people have managed to succeed given the right conditions, as I said, finding the right people to associate with, and having a strong belief in the importance of their actions. This is why faith in the Buddha's awakening is such an important thing, because the Buddha was awakened by what? By his own actions. And it wasn't any special divine quality that he had and we don't have. He simply developed the qualities that he had that we can develop as well. So look at your life and see what qualities need to be developed in that direction. The traditional list of the perfections is a good one to think about because it can apply not only to monastic life but also to lay life. And not only to times when you're on retreat like this or times when you're in the monastery or times when you're meditating, but to all your activities throughout the day. Look at all your activities as opportunities to develop good qualities in your mind, because those are the things that last. The Buddha calls them noble treasures because when you develop good qualities in the mind they stay with you, not only in this lifetime but on into future lifetimes. What are the perfections? Generosity, virtue, renunciation, discernment, energy, tolerance or endurance, truth, determination, goodwill, and equanimity. Sometimes when conditions are difficult, you've got to work on the equanimity and the endurance. Other times when opportunities are good, you have to work more on the energy, not to let good opportunities pass you by. When you keep these qualities in mind, you find that you've got the opportunity to practice the Dhamma, to develop qualities that should work in your dealings with other people. Now you may look at your life and feel that your circumstances are not conducive enough. That's when you may decide that you have to change the circumstances of your life. But the basic conditions you need are the two I mentioned just now. Learn to associate with people who believe, 1. in the importance of developing skillful qualities and 2. in your ability to do it. Building on that, hold to the conviction that if you want your life to have a point, you have to give it a point, and you can do that. No matter how discouraging the facts you can observe in your life, don't believe that the observable facts are telling the total story or that your future is already cast in concrete. You constantly have the ability to change your mind, to develop more skillful intentions, to learn from your past mistakes, so that you can bring those truths of the will to fruition. As today's session draws to a close, we extend an invitation for ongoing engagement. Just as Buddha advocated sharing his teachings for the greater good, we urge your involvement. Help propagate these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your active contribution ensures these invaluable insights transcend boundaries. Embrace this opportunity to ignite positive change and nurture empathy. We eagerly anticipate your presence in future episodes, uniting to enlighten minds and cultivate compassion globally.